How can we get our organisations that are governed by KPIs and OKRs to focus on building the options we need to access in times of crisis? So the additional colour for this question, John and Colin, is, do you have any suggestions or recommendations when, as a direction of travel, you want to have a set of options in the cupboard that you have described as working well in traditional R&D-led industries? But in the immediate day-to-day focus that exists in our larger companies, there's a focus on KPIs and OKRs that are set for the specific period of 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year. How do you get people to focus on building that cupboard with options that you can draw on in times of crisis? Obviously, you can't just put things in there and leave them and come back to them later. It's just not realistic to do so. The relationships that you were building, you need to keep that engagement so it's not just an utterly transactional interaction in a moment of crisis or moment of immediate need. Do you have any recommendations of how you encourage people to change their behaviours, to think more expansively and in a more innovation-led manner? Thank you.
Yeah. So a couple of points on that, and then I'll hand over to John because I'm sure he's got some thoughts as well. I think the first thing I would say is that, again, the more progressive organizations appoint what we call an innovation curator. An innovation curator's job is to basically look after the cupboard. And it's the things that are perhaps not being used right now, but potentially may have benefits in the future. And they actually spend a portion of someone's time looking at what's there, keeping it fresh, using it to stimulate thinking in different parts of the organization, looking for cross-fertilization opportunities. And often these people are quite heavily connected to those that are listening to outside signals. So if you have scouts, be they technology scouts or trend scouts in the organization, it's quite an interesting connection between the scouts and the innovation curators. So what stuff have we got on the shelf, and what stuff is coming down the path? Potentially we might have some early stage ideas of being able to develop something that perhaps is going to, let's say, lead us toward a trend. I'm going to give you a very practical example of this. So some of you may have heard me speak before about an organization called Stora Enso. And Stora Enso are a Nordic paper and pulp company. Now, there was a point in time where it was pretty obvious that the coming trend, the coming disruption was people are going to stop using paper to anything like the extent that they have in the past. And they went to the cupboard. And what they found was in the cupboard, they had some experiments and some material scientists and some clever people who had developed in understanding of the chemical properties of trees and using some of the components, the underlying components of trees and certain wood products that could be used for alternatives. So, for example, some trees generate things that you might see as a competitor to a fossil lubricant, perhaps. And what they did is to say, okay, we see that coming trend. Now, of course, they had the luxury that the disruption happened slowly. They could see it coming. But what they did know is that demand for paper was going to drop to 40% of peak levels, and there was nothing they could do about it. And so they saw the scouts said, okay, this is the coming trend. And the people that were looking after the cupboard said, okay, well, what about maybe creating a new business around something called biomaterials? And that's what they did. They built a biomaterials business, which is completely different to the paper and pulp, cardboard type business. And all of the revenue for that company pretty much comes from the paper and pulp business, but it's very low margin, very, very low margin. But all the profit comes from this quite small speedboat that's running by the side, where they're using their competency in a different kind of way. And so I think the idea of connecting the scouts, the people who are listening to external signals, with the people who are looking after the cupboard. And actually, I was in a presentation a few years ago in Berlin, and Chief Innovation Officer from Airbus came walking up to me and said, Colin, I've just realized I don't have an innovation curator. I have a shelf, I have a cupboard, I have a big long list of stuff that we're working on, but no one looking after it. To your point, Kate, it can't just be a one-off exercise. It has to be an ongoing process to make sure that we make use of those ideas when the opportunities arise. John, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the curator is a hugely important role, and one we've underestimated for a long time. That classic phrase, does insert the name of any large organization. Does Siemens, does Stora, does BAE, does anyone know what it really knows? And of course, organizations are sitting on stuff that isn't necessarily made available to them. So I think curation is important. I would add one other thing. It's not just a cupboard. I think the need for a living capability. I think a lot of organizations recognize the need for that, and there are ways of persuading them, scaring them, or enlightening them, but a lot of them will set up what I would call an adventure group. So you park it somewhere else. It's by definition a long way from the core of the business, and it's got a license to think differently, to play, to experiment, all the things we've been talking about, and to work in very different ways. And it's important to give this enough of a sort of escape velocity that it isn't captured by the mainstream organization. The risk to all of that is that, and my colleague Julian Birkinshaw has a lovely phrase for this. Julian at London Business School says, these groups often have a short life, but a happy one. And I think that really nails it, because they have this wonderful freedom to play, to explore, but they're often so much at the edge that they're very easy to cut free. The kind of centripetal force that sort of is pulling them away, they fly off. If things turn, as they inevitably do, to KPIs and let's batten down the hatches, it's the first bit you jettison. So in a sense, the real challenge is this one of what I mentioned earlier, ambidexterity. Setting up that capacity to do the thinking, to do the creating for stuff that might fill the cupboard with wonderfully interesting new stuff is great, but we've got to have a way of linking it to the main organization in a living way, a kind of umbilical cord. It's that kind of organic relationship rather than simply a structural one. And I've seen many examples. Recently, the last couple of years, I was involved with a big German company, and they did lots of great thinking about their adventure group. And they set this up very carefully in Berlin, which was going to be the buzzy startup center, a long way from their traditional Middle Germany headquarters. And they mirrored this in other places around the world. So these teams were set up with a fanfare, and there was a sense across the whole organization, yeah, we need this capacity. What, of course, has happened over time is that the bridges weren't really built as effectively as they could be. Lots of great stuff has come out of those groups. And to be fair, the parent company still takes the rent in the sense that it's getting financial return, but the spin-off businesses, the things that have gone on to do things and to work in very different ways, are really lost to the main organization. So I guess for me, there is this importance of having some capacity, but also paying attention to linking it, keeping the bridges, being ambidextrous between that and the mainstream organization.